This week on Act Out, meat is not good for you, even if it's good for you. Next, the charred reality driving deforestation and greenwashed consumer products in your markets. Plus, Fight Toxic Prisons joins us to talk direct action solidarity with prisoners and the layers of toxicity in the prison industrial complex. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. As with any story, the corporate media fawned and cooed over the Amazon rainforest and then unceremoniously chucked it, never to be spoken of again until it's on fire again. Meanwhile, their coverage was paltry at best, avoiding key causes and context and missing connections, because if they can make you believe that the Amazon is burning in a vacuum, well, they've not only managed to make you believe in the impossible, they've killed legitimate solutions and collaboration before they can ever get going. Instead, they can prop up false solutions, like petitioning Bolsonaro, or sending money to the Sierra Club, or some other equally useless ask. They won't talk about how capitalism is driving the destruction of irreplaceable rainforest for the sake of our meat consumption. Because meat's good, right? In late September, outlet after outlet released reports saying that new reviews of previous health advice found no issues with eating meat, or even processed meats. This, of course, flies in the face of years of research that suggest eating both meat and, even more so, processed meat and other foods is harmful to your health. Now, let's just say that the new reports are accurate. And I know that a lot of folks watching this show are vegan or vegetarian, but just follow me on this one. Let's just say that for you personally, stuffing your face with a dead cow 3 times a day is just awesome. You still shouldn't do it. Because if we continue or increase our meat consumption, you can kiss your life on this planet goodbye, starting with the Amazon. Because as we covered on this show, the fires in the Amazon were man-made. Loggers burning vast areas of rainforest to clear land for mining and cattle grazing. Fires that escalated after Bolsonaro announced that he wanted to make more room for industry. Indigenous peoples and humanity's future be damned. Meanwhile, outside of the Amazon, the climate effects of cattle are tremendous. Funny though it may sound at first, cow farts do actually contribute to climate change. A typical cow releases 100 kilograms of methane a year, and the world has about 1 billion cows. Since methane is a greenhouse gas, this does actually exacerbate global warming. Of course, then there's the issue of waste. Wastes from feedlots and fertilizers used to grow their feed overnourish water, a nice way of saying polluting, causing weeds to choke all other life. And the pesticides, antibiotics, and hormones used to treat them get into drinking water and endanger human health. The pollution washes down to the sea, killing coral reefs and creating dead zones devoid of life. So, pick your poison. Forest fires, dead sea zones, contaminated groundwater, greenhouse gases. Or if none of those really tickle your fancy, try animal rights on for size. Because the twisted life behind that bloody stake makes Texas Chainsaw Massacre look like a children's cartoon. Often referred to as factory farming, but more honestly named torture farming by comedian Lee Camp, these industrial-sized operations house tens of thousands of animals in cages so small that animals can oftentimes not even turn around. Shoved full of antibiotics and feed designed to deliver big dead meat sacks. Animals are often on top of this abused, kept inside their entire lives or much of them. Animals deemed unnecessary or not useful will be tossed aside and left to die, and when sweet death does come, it is gruesome and inhumane. According to 2012 numbers, there were more than 12 million heads of cattle housed in these CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations. According to USDA data, between 2011 and 2017, top cattle ranching states, predominantly in the Midwest, have added 995,000 head of cattle. Almost 1 million more heads of cattle, or as they can be also called, cows. Meanwhile, outside of the horrors of the CAFO life for cows, there's the reality of what these operations mean for smaller ranchers. As with other industries, 4 mega ag companies dominate the market, and therefore dominate how the industry operates, cracking down on everything from animal rights to ranchers' autonomy and income. In other words, even if a rancher wanted to run a humane operation, they can't, because they won't be able to fill the orders handed to them by Big Ag and will therefore shut down. A story played on repeat between 1980 and 2008 when some 516,000 small ranchers shut down operations. And look, that's not to say that all of them were looking to do Monday massages for their cows, but that does mean that this consolidation of power makes it ever more impossible to improve conditions for both cows and workers. One thing that can make a difference, however, cutting rates of consumption. And herein lies the cornerstone of this story. Let's just say again that eating meat isn't bad for you personally. It's horrible for the planet. It's torturous and sick for the animals themselves. We don't live in a vacuum. We can't just look at whether or not something is good for us personally, individually. We live in a vast horror story of overconsumption and convenience based solely on the individual. For instance, there are no adverse health effects in using an entire roll of toilet paper every time you go to the bathroom. However, based on 2010 numbers, some 27,000 trees are felled a day for just toilet paper alone. And that's sure as shit, pun intended, an adverse effect. We have to look outside of our own body and consider the effects of human activity and consumption on the entire ecosystems that we're a part of. And that same thinking holds true if we're talking about personal choice. So instead of shaming a poor person for buying shit at Walmart and eating bad meat because they live in a food desert and it's cheaper than organic tofu, we have to aim our ire at the systems that create and maintain these horrifically wasteful structures. It's not that person's fault for driving to work. It's the fault of 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of all global emissions. Our military, the largest single consumer of fossil fuels in the world, not to mention the world's largest terrorist force. It's the fault of some 20 fossil fuel companies who are responsible for 1/3 of all carbon emissions. Thinking in terms of the individual makes no sense, neither regarding harm created nor harm mitigated. We need to think and act beyond our individual bubbles. So yes, eat less meat. But understand that we all need to eat less meat, that global paradigms regarding consumption of food and products has to shift, which thereby requires action that looks beyond personal choice. It requires action that rattles thrones and dismantles systems. So really, what all of these headlines should say is, regardless of personal diets, the only way to support a healthy society and planet is to drastically cut global consumption of meat. And drastically kill capitalism. Another aspect behind the personal choice revolution is the insidious rise of greenwashed solutions, the slapping of the word sustainable on artisanal products that do their best to hide the grossly extractive and unsustainable background from which they came. One of the more egregious examples of that is coming out of South America, where the second largest forest, Gran Chaco, is also on fire. And behind this man-made nightmare, beyond the cattle, charcoal. And not just any run-of-the-mill charcoal, by the way, environmentally friendly charcoal. In true capitalist fashion, it's not enough to just destroy forests for the sake of cattle grazing. You then further profit off the destruction by burning those felled trees for charcoal. Think of it as the morbidly twisted twin of use every part. Increasingly, some Paraguayan ranchers are realizing that there's money to be made off those felled trees too. Rather than just incinerating the wood in their fields, they turn it into carbón, or charcoal in English. That charcoal is then stacked high on trucks that carry it to Paraguayan exporters who ship it to Europe, the Middle East, and the United States, among other major markets. And folks might be thinking, well, shit, Eleanor, why not? I mean, you've already cut the tree down. Why not go ahead and burn it? Makes extra cash for the farmer and utilizes that felled tree. So here's the problem. Paraguayan charcoal may be a, quote, natural product, but it's hardly environmentally friendly. That's because making and selling charcoal from recently cut trees that previously went to waste, makes deforestation more profitable. As a result, purchases of this product indirectly contribute to the deforestation of the Chaco. Still, charcoal isn't just an eco-friendly Eurofad. In southwestern Madagascar, the Makia tribe is facing an existential environmental crisis, as their home forest is rapidly being chopped down to supply a growing demand for charcoal, the country's primary source of cooking fuel. At least 15,000 hectares of dry forest located to the north and south of Toliara, the closest major city to Makia Forest, are raised each year for fuel wood, according to the NGO Worldwide Fund for Nature, Madagascar. To more literally consider Greta Thunberg's quote, the Makia's house is actually on fire. They refer to the Makia forest as the ancestors' forest. They harvest food and medicine from practically every single plant. And as with so many other frontline climate chaos fights across the globe, the Makia, the indigenous peoples, are not only the most affected by this threat, they are the ones fighting the hardest. Chief Indala of the Makia has set up a hut in the forest in order to listen for the sound of chopping. Governments don't move fast enough to address the realities of climate chaos. They treat it like something that might happen later, but it's actually happening now. Gran Chaco is on fire now. The Makia forest is being destroyed now. And next week we will bring you a special report from the Shawnee Forest in southern Illinois, where folks converged last week in order to connect struggles, build power, and lay plans for direct action and real solutions in the face of false solutions and political stagnation. So something that demands attention and a non-corporatized, non-Murica analysis is the situation in northern Syria. Lee Camp and I go into more detail on our podcast Common Censored, but it's vital that we understand how this fits into the US playbook of creating and bolstering terrorists. The Turkish government has long supported Daesh, also known as ISIS, both with weapons and backing. The YPG, the Kurdish forces, have been the most effective and powerful opposition to Islamic extremists in the world. Islamic extremists, by the way, that the United States itself created. And while this move of backing Turkey as they commit war crimes against the Kurds has drawn some rumblings from both parties, the bottom line is that the US has never cared about the Kurds. As with any other people around the globe, we use them and cast them aside. Their fate is dictated by our imperial goals and certainly not by any desire to squash terrorism. Again, we create terrorists because in order to keep the war machine rolling, there's always got to be someone to fight. Indeed, this move isn't in and of itself terrorism. As the weekend rolled on, reports of escaped Daesh prisoners and ISIS flags popped up across the internet. And as of Sunday, the United Nations said that more than 130,000 Syrians have fled since the operation began 5 days ago, including many who had taken refuge from previous rounds of fighting in the country's 8-year civil war. The Turkish alliance with Daesh and other extremist groups has and will only cause one thing: widespread terrorist atrocities. And that blood is on our hands. The only way to wash it is to act in solidarity with Rojava, in solidarity with justice and autonomy, and always in opposition to the largest terrorist organization in the world, the US military. Finally, today we turn from the military-industrial complex to the prison-industrial complex, two parallel diseases that together cover nearly the entire globe, and whose toxic reach affects every part of our ecosystems. Last week, we talked with May Azad from Fight Toxic Prisons about direct action in solidarity with prisoners, and the toxic realities not only inside of prisons, but that literally make up the foundations of this sick, twisted industry. Take a look.
So on October 1st, a group called DC Abolition Coalition convened an action outside of the DOJ, effectively shutting down both of their garage entrances all day, pretty much, from noon until 5 p.m. And they did this by erecting 4 ladders in front of the garage entrances, two each, and then 2 people were chained to each ladder. So folks were locked down on top of the ladder, and then folks were either U-locked, like a bike lock around their neck to the bottom of the ladder, or a lockbox, which is just another tactic for holding space. Basically, we were there both uplifting local abolitionist demands, primarily that DC not build a new jail, and that the current DC jail stop collaborating with ICE. And since the action, there actually has been progress on that second demand. So there were a few other demands, but I won't speak on them here. If folks are curious, they can go read up on them on our press release at fighttoxicprisons.com. And then as far as the solidarity with Alabama, this has to do with the Department of Justice having issued a report back in April saying that they were going to file a lawsuit against the Alabama Department of Corrections in 7 weeks if they didn't get all of these human rights abuses and Eighth Amendment violations remediated. And so basically this report, it was a formal report outlining all sorts of forms of cruel and unusual punishment, from routine sexual assault, sexual abuse, physical assault, physical abuse, medical neglect, all of the things that we've known about for years and that folks inside have been fighting against for years. Finally, the DOJ came out with this report, putting it all in writing and saying that they were going to do something about it. And 6 months later, they've done nothing, and conditions have only worsened. This is not just out of the blue, like we didn't just randomly show up 6 months later. There have been demonstrations on the ground in Alabama, outreach on the ground outside of Alabama prisons. And about a week before this demo at the DOJ, around a dozen family members, primarily wives and mothers and children of incarcerated folks in Alabama, did come up to DC to air these same demands, and the DOJ did nothing. And so we decided that we needed to step things up a notch if we wanted them to be heard. As we've said in the past, we're only going to continue upping the pressure until we get results. We can't discuss like concrete tactics publicly at this moment, but we do know that our enemies are also ramping up their pressure, and that Kay Ivey, the governor of Alabama, is in the process of outlining plans for constructing 3 new prisons. So these are 3 new mega prisons in Alabama, while they already can't run the existing ones. And so interfering with that process is going to be another strategy, because we know that, yes, we can ask the DOJ to do their job all we want, but at the end of the day, we need to stop things in a concrete way, and we need to take action for ourselves insofar as the DOJ and the Alabama Department of Corrections refuse to secure justice for our comrades inside. So nothing that we're saying, none of these demands, none of our narrative or rhetoric is just coming from us on the outside. Everything that we say and every action that we take is in coordination and in solidarity with folks inside. And so we do like consistent just relationship building. This is coming from a place of love, and trust building. And so we correspond with a bunch of folks inside and ask them to correspond with each other to make sure that everyone is on the same page before we move forward.
And real quick, before I move to the other aspects of Fight Toxic Prisons, one of the responses that oftentimes is thrown at folks who do prison abolition work, like you, is, these people on the inside have done bad things. Like, why of all people or groups should we focus on helping them?
Oh, for sure. Oh, there's so many reasons. That's a really good question. I would say, first of all, like, some people have done bad things. Some people have made mistakes and wrong choices, but I could say the same about anyone in the free world. Politicians make bad choices and mistakes and harm people all the time. The police make mistakes and harm people routinely. You and I have both made mistakes. All of us are potential prisoners. It's just an issue of factors like racial and socioeconomic and gendered factors that cause people to be criminalized. And that's not okay. And so we think that for one, it's not okay that just because someone got caught doing something, just because someone was criminalized for something, that it's okay to throw them away. We don't believe that. I personally will say that I do believe in consequences for people's actions, but I don't think that the state throwing people in cages and disposing of them is at all going to help the problem. So most people who are incarcerated, the vast majority will be released and will rejoin their communities in the free world. And overwhelmingly, they are released traumatized and under-resourced, and this doesn't help them. It doesn't help society. And so we need to find alternative ways to remediate harm and to just understand harm and not through the state's terms.
So with that, toxic prisons, this action highlights the internal toxicity of prisons outside of the environmental aspects, which I want to get to next. But first, can you talk more about the toxic realities of prison life that Fight Toxic Prisons deals with?
Absolutely. So I guess before I go into all this, I just want to be transparent that I'm not formerly incarcerated. And so my understandings on this are always going to be limited. So I'm functioning from a place of like someone who has loved ones who are incarcerated and who has listened to them and is relaying their message. So I just want to say that off top. And as a general framing for how prisons are toxic and why toxic prisons takes this stance, is that we understand that all prisons are toxic because of that culture of disposability. So it's not just about the buildings themselves or the land that they're on themselves, but it's about all humans are in environments. Wherever we are, that's our habitat, that's our ecosystem. And the prison environment is always toxic because of the way that people are abused and neglected. And so just off top, like we have to start with that understanding. But once we do know that, and a lot of us in FTP do come from an environmental justice and an ecological defense background. And so we're also very, very concerned with the material realities of what it looks like to live in a toxic space, whether that is bacterial contamination of water like H. pylori that we're seeing in Texas, or whether that's mold contamination that is rampant all over the South and just anywhere where there's moisture, overheating and underheating during the winter and summer months. And so basically every way that we experience toxicity out here, it's amplified on the inside. Yeah.
With nowhere to go, of course.
Exactly. Yeah. And no ability to adapt.
And with regards to that environmental aspect, a lot of prisons people don't know are built on Superfund sites, like sites that are so toxic that they tell people not to go there. And this is where we build prisons. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right, exactly. So for anyone who isn't familiar, a Superfund site is a federal designation. So that's the federal government itself saying this piece of land is not suited for human life, for human activity, and the EPA needs to remediate it. And so there's like a list of these sites. A lot of them will include former landfills, manufacturing sites, former military sites, mining sites. And a lot of, especially federal prisons, are built on these sites. And they are oftentimes in very remote areas where it's difficult for family members to visit. It's difficult for media to get out there and investigate what's happening. And there are countless examples from Victorville here in California to Red Onion State Prison in Virginia to Carswell in Texas to Rikers in New York. Every single region has several of them. And yeah, it's really just an example of what I've been talking about in terms of this culture of disposability, where this land is seen as disposable, like it's beyond repair, and then the government thinks it's okay to throw people who they see as beyond repair on that land as well.
Talk about this, how this issue of toxicity is also amplified by climate chaos.
Right, yeah. So like I said, every single way that we have to deal with the realities of climate chaos out here, folks inside deal with it to an amplified degree with no ability to adapt. And that's really scary. Because it's already scary out here. And I think a lot of times people frame climate chaos and climate change as this impending doom, this impending apocalypse, where it's like, oh, things are going to get really scary really soon. But when it comes to looking at incarcerated populations, I think it's important to note that things have been really bad for a really long time already. Since Hurricane Katrina, we've been aware of folks being left in neck deep in toxic floodwaters with no ability to evacuate for days on end without running water or food. And I think that's apocalyptic already. And so basically, FTP just doesn't want these people to be left behind. We don't think it's okay at all. And we are kind of in our first few years of advocating for mass evacuations of prisons, jails, detention centers, juvies in these evacuation zones. And this year, I think, has been our most successful. During Hurricane Dorian, we were able to get several facilities in Florida evacuated. Yet South Carolina, for the third year in a row, continues to leave folks behind. So yeah, we're finding our tactics there a little bit. But it's not just hurricanes. There's lots of other forms of natural disasters that we need to be paying attention to, and also things that aren't necessarily framed as disasters because they're a little bit more insidious. So, for example, extreme heat. In Alabama, the guys that I correspond with tell me that it's been in the 120s and that they are staying in dorms with concrete walls and tin roofs with no air conditioning, limited access to opening their windows, if at all. And then we also need to look at extreme cold in the winter. So these things are also getting worse and can't be ignored.
After the Fight Toxic Prisons action outside the DOJ, the D.C. City Council passed the Sanctuary Values Emergency Amendment Act of 2019, an important first step toward ending collaboration between D.C. agencies and immigration and customs enforcement. So, keep up to date with the work that Fight Toxic Prisons is doing by visiting fighttoxicprisons.wordpress.com. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Reminder, the best way to stay up to date on our work is to sign up for the newsletter at the address below. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch. We got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and set my shove. I'm not a